Certainly. Here's the beginning of your sophisticated, fascinating, and engaging story for your YouTube channel on the theme, Huzoor, say Muhabbat. In the quiet lanes of old Lahore, where time seemed to move slower and every cobblestone whispered forgotten tales, there lived a man named Haroon. He was a professor of philosophy by profession, measured, rational, and often lost in thought. His bookshelves were lined with works of Rumi, Ghazali, and even Western thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Yet, despite his vast knowledge, Haroon carried an emptiness that no book could fill. It was an ache, indefinable, persistent. One rainy evening, as the city exhaled the fragrance of petrichor and distant azan echoed like a divine lullaby, Haroon stood at his window, lost in reverie. That's when he noticed an old man sitting under the neem tree across the street. The man had a luminous face, wrapped in a green shawl, with prayer beads in hand. He wasn't a beggar, nor did he seem to belong to the usual world of Haroon's academic circle. But something about him, perhaps the calmness that danced in his eyes, stirred something within. The next day, curiosity tugged at Haroon's thoughts like an unfinished sentence. He crossed the street and greeted the old man. "Assalamu alaikum," he said. "Wa alaikum assalam, beta," the man replied, smiling gently. "You look like someone who reads too much and listens too little." Haroon chuckled awkwardly. "Perhaps. I teach philosophy. I suppose it comes with the job." The old man nodded slowly. "And what do your books say about Ishq-e-Rasool?" Haroon blinked, momentarily silenced. He had read about it, of course. Quoted poetry from Iqbal and Bulleh Shah. Written essays on Sufi interpretations of love for the prophets. But when it came to feeling it, truly and deeply, he hesitated. It was like describing the taste of honey by reading the chemistry of sugar. "I'm not sure," Haroon admitted. "I don't think I've experienced it as you mean." The old man patted the bench beside him. "Then sit, and I'll tell you a story. A story not from a book, but from a heart that once broke and was stitched together with the threads of Muhabbati Mustafaj." And so Haroon listened. The man began, "There was once a slave in Medina, named Safwan. Dark-skinned, born without privilege, and often mocked by those who claimed piety. He worked in the date orchards, silently, patiently. But at night, he would climb to a hill outside the city and recite Salawat upon the Prophet, with tears streaming down his face. Not because he sought reward, but because he couldn't help it. His heart had fallen in love. One night, Rasulullah saw Safwan in a dream. The next day, he asked his companions, 'Where is the one who sends Salawat upon me from the hilltop?' They were confused, none knew. But the Prophet sent Bilal, R.A., to find him. When Safwan stood before the Messenger of Allah, his hands trembling, the Prophet embraced him and said, 'O Safwan, your love reached me before your footsteps did.'" Haroon felt his throat tighten. The professor, the rationalist, suddenly found the ground beneath his intellect melting. The old man turned to him. "Beta, Muhabbat for Huzoor isn't something you perform. It's something that overtakes you. Like a tide. Like the scent of roses in spring. You don't plan it. You surrender to it." That night, Haroon couldn't sleep. He walked the silent streets of Lahore, the call of Ishq now echoing in his bones. The minarets of Badshahi Masjid stood tall under the moonlight, as if listening to the confessions of seekers. Haroon sat on the cool marble, the night breeze carrying faint whispers of Ya Rasool olives. He closed his eyes and whispered it too, for the first time, not from his lips, but from a place deep within. A place even he had forgotten existed. The days that followed changed him. His lectures softened, his words carried a new warmth. He found himself tearing up at knots, lingering in Daikar, yearning to hear the stories of the Prophet, not just for information, but for transformation. One morning, a student asked him, "Sir, you used to speak of logic. Now you speak of longing. What changed?" Haroon smiled. "I met someone who taught me that the heart knows what the mind can only wonder." But the transformation wasn't always easy. Haroon's peers mocked him. One colleague even said, "Philosopher turned poet of the unseen, eh?" Haroon only smiled. If they knew what it meant to ache with love for the Prophet, they wouldn't mock. They'd melt. Then came a Friday, a gathering in a small mosque where an elderly man recited a knot. Wo jo na thay to kuch na tha, wo jo na han to kuch na ho. John hain wo jahan ki, John hai to jahan hai. The verses pierced Haroon's soul like arrows dipped in honey. He wept, his heart shattering in devotion. In that moment, he felt as if he were Safwan, standing before a prophet whose love reached hearts across time and space. And in that moment, Haroon no longer felt the weight of his intellectual pride, nor the shackles of his self-image. He felt only the overwhelming tide of a love that was purer than logic and deeper than thought, something that could not be taught in classrooms nor explained in footnotes. It was the kind of love that made your soul tremble in the middle of the night when the streets were silent, and the only sound was your own heartbeat repeating a name, Muhammad. That night, Haroon walked home under a sky dusted with stars, and for the first time in years, he didn't analyze the constellations or ponder the physics of light. He simply looked up and whispered, Ya Rasulallah, as though he believed, knew, that the heavens carried those words to a sanctified ear. It was as though his heart had found its compass, and all his wandering had finally led him to this point. Not a place, but a presence. Not an idea, but a reality more vivid than the world around him. Over the weeks that followed, Haroon's life transformed with a quiet intensity. He began rising before far, not because he feared missing it, but because he longed to greet the silence before dawn with durud on his lips. His home, once lined with framed certificates and dusty theses, now held a simple calligraphic piece above his study. As salatu was salamu alayka, ya Rasulallah. And every time he looked at it, something inside him softened. One day, he visited a bookstall in the old bazaar. The bookseller, an old man with a patchy beard and eyes sharp with experience, watched him browsing through some modern literature. You won't find what you're looking for there, he said suddenly. Haroon looked up, a little startled. I'm just looking, he replied. No one ever just looks in a place like this, the man said, grinning. They're either running from something or running to something. Haroon paused, then asked, and what are they running toward when they buy books like these? He gestured toward a worn-out copy of Shama'il al-Tirmidhi that lay to the side. The bookseller touched it reverently. Toward the only one who was loved in the heavens before the earth even knew his name. Haroon bought the book without bargaining. That night, he read about the Prophet's smile, his gait, his humility, and his mercy. He read how he would mend his clothes, visit the sick, play with children, and weep in the night for a people yet to be born. He read until his vision blurred, and he wasn't sure whether the tears were from his eyes or his soul. One narration gripped him. When the Prophet visited Uhud and buried his beloved companions, he wept, not because of loss alone, but out of love. Haroon sat silently, the candle flickering beside him, and whispered, Would you have remembered me too, Ya Rasulallah, had I lived then? Would my name have passed your lips in those long nights of prayer when you begged for your Ummah's forgiveness? And in the depths of his heart, a voice without words whispered, He already did. This thought was enough to overwhelm him for days. He would walk the campus, past the same classrooms, the same dusty staircases, but everything looked changed. He noticed the small things now, the birds that gathered near the masjid courtyard, the smell of old paper in the library, the face of the janitor who always greeted him with Assalamu alaikum. Each of these moments became drenched in a tenderness he couldn't explain. Because now, every act of beauty, every hint of gentleness reminded him of him. One evening, Haroon visited a friend who was mourning the loss of his young son. The room was heavy with silence, interrupted only by stifled sobs. The man looked broken, sitting beside the child's untouched toys. Haroon didn't speak at first. He simply sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. When the friend finally spoke, he said, How do you find meaning after this? And Haroon, gently, replied, There was a man who buried 6 of his own children. And yet he still smiled, still gave, still loved. If he could carry that burden and still light the world with his mercy, perhaps we, too, can carry ours with love for him in our hearts. The friend wept again, but this time with a different pain. One that healed as it broke. Soon, Haroon's reputation began to change. Students no longer described him as the cold, cerebral professor. They spoke of him with a quiet respect, as someone who now carried something, some depth that went beyond words. Some even began to attend his weekly halakha, where he no longer lectured, but reflected. They would sit cross-legged on the carpet as Haroon recited stories from the Seerah, weaving them not as history, but as mirrors. Mirrors in which each listener could see not just the messenger, but also the parts of themselves they had forgotten. He told them about Tarif, not as a tale of rejection, but as a lesson in resilience. He told them of the Prophet's sandals, cracked and worn, not to pity him, but to understand how humility walked through the streets of Medina. He told them about his laughter, soft and sincere, and about the way he would turn his whole body to someone when speaking, as though saying, "In this moment, you are the most important person to me." One of his students, a young woman named Sunnah, once asked during the circle, "How do we know our love for him is real and not just imitation?" Haroon replied, "When your heart hurts upon hearing his name, when you smile without reason in the middle of his praise, when you long to see him in your dreams more than you long to see any place in this world, Tichin, it is real. And when you begin to treat others more gently, speak more kindly, forgive more easily, not because it benefits you, but because it reminds you of him, then that love is alive." Sunnah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. One day, Haroon visited the shrine of Data Ganj Baksh. Not for ritual, but for reflection. The sun was setting, bathing the ancient stones in amber light. He sat at the outer courtyard, letting the atmosphere wrap around him. Nearby, a kavval sang softly. Main to Panahan Main Hoon Uski. Jo Muhammad, Ka Hai. Haroon closed his eyes. In that moment, he saw not visions, but felt presence. As though somewhere, somehow, beyond the limits of time and place, the Prophet had heard every salawat, every tear, every whispered Ya Rasulallah. That was the moment Haroon realized something profound. Love for the Prophet doesn't grow like a tree from a single seed. It unfolds like a sunrise, slow, golden, and inevitable for those who turn their faces toward it. Soon after, Haroon received an invitation to speak at a national interfaith dialogue conference. The topic, Spiritual Anchors in the Modern World. When he stood before the audience, a mix of scholars, clergy, and seekers, he didn't speak from a script. He closed his notes and began. "I spent most of my life looking for certainty in reason. I built my world on questions. But it was only when I fell in love with the most merciful of men that I found the answers I didn't even know I was looking for. He taught me that the highest truth isn't what can be proven, but what transforms. And nothing transforms like love, for the divine, and for the one he sent as a mercy to all the world." There was silence when he finished. Not out of confusion, but reverence. A kind of collective stillness that wrapped the room like a shawl of remembrance. Afterward, a Christian minister approached him. "I don't know your Prophet," he said, "but after hearing you speak, I wish I did." Haroon smiled. "Then begin with his mercy. You'll find everything else within it." That night, he returned home and sat once again beneath the soft light of his study. He opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "All the knowledge I gathered has bowed before one truth. Love for the messenger is not part of the path. It is the path. And as the ink dried, the city around him breathed its own silent salawat, carried in the hush of night, in the fluttering of curtains, in the flicker of street lamps. Somewhere, a child recited a nasht before sleep. Somewhere else, an old woman raised her hands, whispering Ya Shafi'ul Ummah. The city of Lahore, ancient and knowing, became a living witness to a love that moved not just in words, but in hearts. And Haroon, the once dispassionate philosopher, found himself no longer a seeker of proofs, but a bearer of light, a light he never lit himself, but one passed down from soul to soul, heart to heart, through centuries. Because once love for the Prophet enters your life, nothing ever stays the same. Everything becomes more tender, more sacred, more real. And so the journey that had begun with questions ended not in answers, but in reverence. Haroon, The man once trapped in the cold corridors of reason, surrounded by theories and footnotes, had been undone by a single truth. The love for the Prophet Muhammad is not something you add to your life, it is the life itself. Once it takes root, it does not ask for space. It redefines your very being. He would often recall the night he first whispered Ya Rasulallah from his soul, and how the wind had felt warmer, the stars closer, the silence more sacred. He knew now that this love was not a feeling that flickered and faded. It was a fire that gently consumed pride, arrogance, and doubt, leaving behind only light. A light that did not glare, it glowed. A love that did not bind, it freed. Months passed, and Haroon found himself less interested in grand debates and more drawn to simple acts of service. He began teaching orphan children in the old mosque near his home, telling them not just of grammar and arithmetic, but of a man who never raised his voice, who smiled even at strangers, who fed the hungry with his own hands, who forgave those who threw stones, and who cried in the darkness. Not for himself, but for us. And the children listened. Not because the stories were dramatic, but because they were real. In the Prophet, they saw a hero unlike any other, majestic yet gentle, powerful yet humble. They didn't just admire him, they longed for him. One of the boys, barely 10, once asked Haroon, "Will we ever see him?" Haroon smiled, his eyes moist. "If we love him truly, if we follow his ways sincerely, then yes. Either in a dream or in the hereafter. And that meeting will be worth every struggle in this world." The boy whispered, "Then I'll try, sir. I'll try every day." And Haroon knew in that moment that the chain of love had found a new link. Another heart had been awakened. Soon, people began noticing changes not just in Haroon's behavior but in his presence. When he entered a room, it was as though he carried the fragrance of Madani Adab with him. He walked slower, spoke softer, and greeted everyone, young and old, with the humility of someone who had learned from the best of all creations. Even his old colleagues, once skeptical of his transformation, began to soften. One of them, a staunch secularist, approached him after a lecture and said, "You've changed, Haroon. But it's not weakness, it's serenity. Where did you find it?" And Haroon simply said, "In the shadow of a man whose footsteps echo across centuries, not with noise, but with mercy." The world outside remained turbulent. News of conflict, injustice, and confusion buzzed constantly. But for Haroon, the compass was now fixed. Whenever overwhelmed, he would return to the books of Seerah, the verses of Durud, the stories of the companions, the poetry of those whose pens bled longing. Every page, every word became a doorway to that radiant heart who once stood on the burning sands of Arabia and changed the destiny of mankind with nothing but truth and tenderness. He began traveling across towns, not as a preacher, but as a lover of the messenger, sharing glimpses of that beauty. In one village, an old farmer wept after hearing him speak about the Prophet's sandals being repaired by his own blessed hands. What kind of leader, the man asked, would serve others before himself? Haroon replied, "Only the one sent by the one who loves his creation more than a mother loves her child." In another town, a teenage girl approached him, unsure, struggling with faith. "How can I love someone I've never seen?" she asked, her voice trembling. Haroon told her, "You see him in every mercy, every act of kindness, every tear of remorse, every smile of sincerity. You see him in your mother's patience, in your father's sacrifices, in the prayer of an old man in the corner of a masjid. And when you send durud upon him with a heart that aches, know this, he responds to you. Not out of duty, but out of love." The girl cried quietly, then said, "I believe you." And belief, real belief, was born. Back in Lahore, Haroon continued his circles of reflection. What began as 10 students grew into hundreds. People came not just to learn, but to feel. The room would fall silent as he read verses of Not or described how the Prophet treated even his enemies with compassion. Sometimes, Haroon would pause mid-sentence, overcome by emotion. And no one minded. Because everyone in that space understood that this was not a lecture. It was a gathering of hearts that missed someone they had never met, yet knew better than anyone. On the anniversary of the Prophet's birth, Haroon led a special night of remembrance. The masjid was filled, candlelight dancing on faces young and old. He spoke of the night when the Prophet was born, a night when the heavens lit up and the fire of Persia, burning for 1,000 years, was extinguished. He described the moment when Amina, R.A., saw a light that reached the palaces of Syria and when Abdul-Muttalib heard the name Muhammad, whispered in his dreams. And then Haroon said something that echoed long after the gathering ended. Brothers and sisters, if that blessed light could pierce through the darkness of the world on the night he was born, then imagine what it can do to the darkness within us, if only we open our hearts. You were not created to chase the world. You were created to chase the footsteps of the one who walked it with perfection. A hush fell over the room. Then tears. Then silence again, the kind that spoke louder than words. Later that night, Haroon walked alone beneath the stars, whispering Durud, his eyes closed, his heart full. He didn't need applause. He didn't seek fame. He only sought one thing, that on the day when all souls are gathered and chaos unfolds, he might be among those who are called by the most beautiful voice, saying, Ummati, Ummati. And if, in that moment, the Prophet turns and sees him, just once, just for a moment, and says, this one loved me, then Haroon knew that every tear, every night of longing, every breath spent in Durud would be worth it. Because in the end, what greater success is there than to be counted among the lovers of the beloved? That is the secret. That is the purpose. That is the path. And Haroon, once lost in the pages of the world, had found his name written softly in the heart of a story that began over 14 centuries ago, when a man stood on a mountain and called humanity not just to faith, but to love. And the echo of that call still reaches us, through stories, through tears, through the trembling whisper of Ya Rasulallah. Forever alive, forever calling, forever transforming those who dare to answer.